Good afternoon. I'm Count Balerian of House Tatters. I'm going to be reading a bit from my chapter, from the latest draft of Chapter 1 of this novel I'm writing. Oh, half a moment. I need to mute that thing. There. Sorry about that. I'm going to just link to. I'm just going to link to. Just going to link to a couple of places really quickly. Let me see. Just one more link. Let me see. Where is this? Let's see if I can find the channel. Here we go. This will do. Okay. Now, about this novel. It takes place on a continent between the Americas and Asia called Isharad. Specifically, it's in the Sandaranian Empire, which is a little to the north and comprises mainland and islands. There are several peoples in the empire, and the ones we have most to do with are the Kallumans and the Sandaranians. It's culturally layered because their culture and their religion are derived from or strongly influenced by Tarania, which is far to the south, and Taranian is the main classical language. Sandaran was also ruled by Chugga for several centuries, and the society was influenced by that. This is a very simplified version. The protagonists find themselves, for various reasons, in conflict with the emperor or emperors. Partly this is because the emperor is a creepo who lusts after a couple of the protagonists, and partly because the empire has a fair bit of injustice, slavery, and whatnot. The novel is called Lady Margret. I might change the name to Margret eventually, but we'll see. So, without any further ado, let me get started. First, let me show the actual novel that I'm writing. Let's see. Window. Here we go. This is what I want. So, Lady Margret, Part 1, Flower of Righteousness. Chapter 1, The River's Shield. Wanayaja Dazaushu, Nyaja, bless her. Waishtaka Nguirihushu, Ishtaka, make her virtuous. Wangara ehi vihushu. Angara, I should say, keep her pure. Wakarat munkushu, Kara, pray for her. Waikri nguzindushu, Ikri, judge her mercifully. Waru ngmandushu, Ru, or love, fill her. Wayiz harum kirambushu, enlightenment, guide her. Wayimuni munkushu, Imuni, that is Karat's mother, guide her. Pray for her. Sorry. Wanihan graushu, Nihandra, defend her. Wajamarad nanyarushu, Jamarad, or earth, sustain her. Wamin daraj mandihushu, Mendaraj, make her temperate and merciful. Wagaran munkushu, Gran, Karat's father, pray for her. Wan fukundushu, Churun huna parya, O God, accept your daughter, the blossom of righteousness. The prayers of Margret's naming ritual resounded from the 9 walls of the temple at Castle Tserthatan in the province of Ichalamu under exalted Ekwekwe IV, Emperor of Sandaran. These prayers were in classical Taranian and were already centuries old on this warm evening of the 24th of Kanyadura, not long after the longest day of the year. It was the 2112th year since the truth had been revealed to Karat. Footnote: 1394 AD. Blessings had been pronounced in the sacred hearth of Nyaja, the sacred garden of Ishtaka, and the sacred fountain of Angara. After being sprinkled with the waters of the Angara, the infant had been presented to the sacred images. Nyaja's forge, Ishtaka's flower, the ways of the Angara, the crown of Ikri the just, the Neru, a woolly marsupial, of Ru the compassionate, the candle of Zaharum, the shield of the valiant Nihandra, the sprout of Jamarad, and the breeze of Mindaraj. The girl had been squalling, but somehow seemed calmer after the gift of the sacred 9-beaded necklace. The story of the birth of Avu having been read from the Waramad, the strictly sacred part of Margret's naming was complete. The girl had been named Huna Parya, blossom of righteousness, but was more often called Margret in her father's native Kallumans. Later, when she visited the imperial court, she would sometimes be called Shirumbawaga, which in Sandaranian came to the same thing. Clad in his state robe, blue with a green triangle on the chest, a red cape symbolizing fatherhood, and a coronet shaped like the head of a saber-toothed tiger, the father stood behind the hearth of Nyaja, holding a ceremonial sword of the native rounded variety. Count Pilamar, the balding father, was about 30, stoutish, and stood a little over 5 foot 6 inches in our measurements. His wife Markaruna, about 5 foot tall and slender, with bright eyes, wore a gown of blue and light green, a yellow scarf in honor of her status as a mother, and a smaller and lighter version of her husband's coronet. She carried a parasol whose perimeter resembled the blue and green peace flower of Tserthaton, and the center a purple calendar flower, with 12 petals in 4 whorls of 3, from her native Palismu. Looking happy, if tired, a good tired, she stood behind the altar of Ishtaka and winked at her husband, whose face, apart from the occasional raised eyebrow, was a mask of formality. Naming rituals were not one of the Count's more enjoyable duties. For one thing, he did not much care for infants, finding them loud and messy and not very interesting to talk to. For another, he had had little luck in begetting children that lived longer than a year and had no heirs male at all. His constant fear was that some greedy hanger-on at court would end up marrying his daughter and making off with the patrimony. The Lady Markaruna of Palismu, on the other hand, loved naming rituals so long as they involved someone else's family. The ritual finished, Pilamar's friends and others came up to him and his wife with congratulations and gifts. "May Ishtaka grant your daughter many years of joy," boomed Count Garawada of Peje, the husband of Pilamar's sister Imuni. Bowing his head, Garawada was a little older than Pilamar, a slightly paler shade of tan, and quite a bit taller. Imuni was a little shorter than her brother, a few years younger, and somewhat austere. They wore similar clothes to Pilamar and Markaruna, except that their colors were black and dark green, their animal the antelope, and their flower the Jitarumuru, a fragrant white flower from Tarania with 3 larger petals and 6 smaller ones. Garawada's ceremonial sword was in the Taranian style, flexible and very slightly curved. "May Nyaja reward you, noble brother-in-law," replied Pilamar. On a less formal occasion, he might have just said brother-in-law, but at a naming ritual, nothing less than noble would do. The aristocracy in those times were very formal indeed, and not uncommonly went by a great one. "And may Ishtaka also grant me a son like yours," he added with a helpless gesture, "to free me from the fear that some corrupt courtier may end up with my lands after my soul has been, we hope, received in heaven. Although I dare say he will anyway. The winds that blow from the court in Tena are not kind." "They never are," said Garawada. "Yajani Pash, what a lovely service." "Great One graces me with great grace," replied the Yajani, or priestess, lowering her head slightly. "And now I will happily yield the child to her wet nurse and join Yaji Vurun in his meditations." "Such a beautiful child," said Imuni to Markaruna, "Ru's blessing upon her and her family." With exquisite poise, she bent down and handed Markaruna a bouquet with the flowers of Ichalamu, Palismu, and Sandaran. "And Jamarad's upon you and yours." Markaruna smiled broadly and kissed the flowers in the Kallumman manner. with her eyelashes. I am not sorry it's over. Childbearing is tiring work. Yes, it is, said Imuni. Ishaka has laid a heavy burden upon us. Next section. The years passed, and Margret grew out of infancy into girlhood, a miniature version of her mother. Along the way, she gained a younger sister who had been named Adri for the great Azargun's heroic sister, but didn't much resemble her namesake in temperament, being rather timid and easily embarrassed. Margret, on the other hand, was feisty albeit fair-minded, and enjoyed dashing through Certhaton with her hobby horse, yelling heroic slogans like, "By the sword of Nihandra," while her plump little sister tagged along clutching a fluffy toy saber-toothed tiger and laughing. Certhaton, the river's shield, was a large castle by provincial standards. Nobles outside of Sandaran were only allowed palaces of 3 levels, 6 being reserved for members of the Sandaranian court, and 9 for the emperor alone. Certhaton's second floor had reception areas, the library, ballroom, and judgment hall. The third floor was reserved for the family, apart from the chapel. Pylamar had got around the size restrictions by adding towers, triangular, according to a symbolic practice that originated, like much else, far to the southeast in Tarania. One of the towers housed the count and countess, the other served as granaries and storehouses for the treasury, and formerly also as a refuge in times of war. Margret longed to climb up into the towers, but the windows were too high, and none might be admitted without the count's express permission. In ancient times, the castle had been a fortress pure and simple, or nearly so, and comfort and beauty had taken a distant second to security. But war seldom came to the castle now. One of the few good things about being in the Sandaranian Empire was that there was now peace, save for occasional raids by the northern barbarians, and Count Pylamar devoted more time and energy to governing his vassals than to fighting his adversaries. Much of the governing took place in the courtyard of Mercy on the second level, where the count addressed his vassals or threw coins to the commons from the balcony of largesse. A semicircular wooden balcony that jutted out of the southern wall. Margret sometimes had to be reprimanded for running circles around the periphery of the courtyard or climbing on the fountain sculptures of Karat, Ruth, the Lady of Love, and a crepe myrtle surrounded by lilies. These were to be revered as symbols of mercy and love, her mother told her. And Margret, contrite, begged the sculpture's pardon. That didn't stop her from climbing the real crepe myrtles while Audrey watered the surrounding lilies, ferns, and peace flowers. A species of Philotacca. Occasionally, the count would show his daughters the columns' carvings of merciful or, on their base, unmerciful actions, or take them out onto the balcony of largesse and show them the paintings of acts of generosity. Never forget, her father told them, that generosity is the greatest virtue in a noble, after wisdom. Yes, noble father, said Margret. What's generosity? Added Adri. That virtue by which those who have more give to those who have less, replied the count. A virtue one would wish to be more honored at court. Now that I mention it, One would wish for any virtues to be more honored at court. That sounds like fairness to me, said Margret, who had no notion what all that meant about virtues in the court. Her father looked pleased. The castle was beautiful in Margaret's eyes. The wooden cylinder had been painted a bright blue, the color of Margaret's family. Atop it, a sculpture of a saber-toothed tiger, the family emblem, stood guard. The towers were a cheerful light green. Margret loved to climb up and down the wooden ladders that connected the 3 levels of the castle, stone stairways being reserved for the court. And when she thought she could get away with it, she would visit the servants' quarter on the ground floor, which was divided in half by the sacred river. Margret loved the river Dathlon, that is, but everyone just called it the river. Her ancestors had worshipped it in the days before the holy Brahm had brought the way and the truth to Ichalamu, and even now was revered, and its spirit believed to be an attendant of the holy Angara. The beauty of its limpid blue waters entranced her, and its murmuring music. This although she had little interest in swimming or boating. Audrey, so timid otherwise, was braver than Margret when it came to boats, or water generally, and longed to sail her coracle through the southern water gate almost as much as Margret longed to ride a horse. Margret, on the other hand, hated the boat sickness. But she loved feeding the animals, the flightless ducks, the water chickens, the fin rats. Sometimes she saw river seals. She would watch the antics of the fish at their play. Catfish, rabbitfish with their strange head fins, mossfish who looked like algae, translucent crystal fish, and several other species. Or she would catch the fish and feed them to the castle's trained otters in their covered pool. Indeed, Margret was happiest outside, in the gardens and forests, wherever there were plants. The tropics were not so very far to the south, on the Mindrite mainland, so the climate was mild and fertile, with a long growing season, and there were blossoms on trees for 3 seasons of the year, except on some of the higher mountains. A multitude of blossoming trees graced the castle grounds. Crepe myrtles joining branches with magnolias and palm trees. It is said that Rachel, the blossom maiden, comes around every spring and adorns the trees with garlands of flowers. Her mother told her daughters. They believed her, and Adri took to dressing up as Rachel for fancy dress parties. Pardon me. Flowers in pots or urns surrounded the castle on all sides and covered much of the roof, especially the miniature wall around the little banquet hall. The chapel and the great banquet hall also had flowers in hanging flower pots. During the warmer months, Margret spent much of her time in the 4 principal gardens, where crocus and amaryllis and poppies, fuchsias and lilies, proteas and calendar flowers of every sort, performed their unmoving dance around the ponds that reflected the sky. The gardens had all been arranged in allegorical patterns, in which Margret was instructed from an early age. The South Garden, she knew, represented the virtues of justice and mercy, in accordance with the comital motto, "Be just and merciful." It was said that Ishtaka had brought the plants and the virtues into existence in one single act of creation. And who could doubt it? Margaret and Audrey would have loved to help. Half a moment. Sorry. Coming. Sorry about that. I had to take a delivery. Okay. Let's see. Where were we? Margret and Adri would have loved to help the gardeners in planting, but that been allowed. But alas, custom forbade it. That is not suitable for a lady, said Markaruna, when the girls asked for permission to plant some tubers. You may tend plants, but may not sow them. Adri, always the more docile, bowed her head. But Margret was not so easily put off. Why, mother? She whinged. Because Ishtaka willed it thus, replied her mother, and that was that. Indeed, the girls learnt to pick flowers and arrange them in painted pots, because that was expected of a lady. Margaret was never very good at it, whereas Adri excelled from an early age. Thwarted in gardening, Margaret took to making figures out of mud and pretending to fight them, whereas she was much better than at flower arrangement. It was upon one of these occasions that her governess caught her in the act and cried out, "No, little great one, this will not do. You must be clean when blessed Yajani Pash comes to hear your catechism. You will rule her one day and marry a powerful lord. It is past time for you to learn to be a lady." Margaret's governess, she was named Varain, was a kindly woman, but terrified Margaret just the same. The younger sister of the Yajani, she seemed ancient, although in reality she was only around 45. Yes, governess, sighed Margret, following Varain to the bathhouse. There she submitted as graciously as possible to being placed in a round, three-legged bathtub and pitilessly scrubbed. This indignity was followed by being dressed in her white temple dress with a many-colored nine-fold star on the blouse. It was beautiful, but for the moment, Margret hated it. Then she felt remorseful and begged Sacred Nine's forgiveness. She knew how important it was to know the truth and to honor the holy ones and their prophet Karat. Her outward garb must show forth this inner truth. So she followed the governess meekly to the temple, where she would be questioned. Now aged 6, Margret knew the foundations of the truth, also called Uchandra, or divine reverence, or Jambra, way and truth, which she had learnt chiefly from her governess and from occasional lessons with the Yajani Pash or her parents. Yaji Vurun, though always kindly, had had little to do with her education. From the Yaji and Yajani, Margret had it fixed in her head that all the clergy were kind and good and would give her sweets in the shape of a ninefold star. Maybe they'll give me one after my catechism. Yajani Pash was around 60 years old and wore a white robe covered with the symbols of the 9 aspects of the Godhead, each in its appropriate color. Her ring and her crimson parasol were both star-shaped. Margret and the governess sat on the floor on green carpets. A chair had been borrowed for Blessed Yajani Pash, as befitted her sacred office. Varain posed the questions while the Yajani watched and took notes. Who revealed the truth, little great one? Margret curtsied in the Taranian fashion by placing her hands on her hips and bending her knees. Karat did. Far to the southeast in Tehran, under the sacred azalea tree Hunchakarai. Who are Sacred Nine? Nyaja, the creator. Ikri, the lawgiver. Nihandra, defender of the weak and innocent. I like him. He helps people who are bullied. Yajani Pash threw back her head in approval, and Varain continued her questioning. They all do, little great one, but name the others for me. Margret curtsied again. Ishtaka, the mother. Ru, the voice of love and compassion. Jamarad, the earth. I like her. She's pretty. Angara, the sacred river of Tehran. She thought for a moment and added, the Dathwan is sacred too, and it goes right under our castle. The Yajani frowned slightly and glanced at the governess. Yes, it does, said Varain, but it's not sacred as the Angara is sacred. Karat never saw it. I know. Margret bowed her head. Although the Holy One Shenathar hallowed the Dathwan with water from the Angara, my gracious mother told me so. Yes, it gets its holiness from the Angara, explained the governess. All waters do. But you have only named 7 of Sacred 9. There are 2 more. Half a moment. There are 2 more. The last 2 are hard, said Margret. Iza Harum, I think it makes us wise. And Mindaraj, I think he helps us be calm or something. Good, said Yajani Pash, handing Margret a small mango cake. When you grow older, you will understand how Sacred 9 are also 3 and 1. Make sure she never forgets these truths, she told Varain. All, from the highest to the lowest, must know them. Yes, blessed Yajani, said Varain with a curtsy. I won't forget, added Margret, likewise curtsying. A visit from the clergy entailed a lot of curtsies. Blessed graces us with great grace. Will you be at supper, Yajani? Yes, child, said Yajani Pash, and rose. Margret and her governess, having curtsied to her one last time, she called for her maid and returned to her quarters in the temple. Thereafter, thrice a week, Margret was taken to the temple, to her delight. The 9 walls of the temple seemed to reach to the sky, and the 3 sacred spaces, hearth, altar, and libation bowl, filled her with awe. She sometimes felt that the ritual took rather a long time, but she loved the brightness of the fire of Nyaja and the candles of Ikri and Nihandra, the tranquility of the fountain of Angara and the pools of Izaharum and Mindaraj, and the beauty of the sacred plants. The azalea tree of Ishtaka, the tree horsetail of Ru, and the club moss tree of Jamarad. The exterior of the temple was even lovelier, with its threefold turrets, symbols of the godhead. Over its sacred garden, dedicated to Mother Ishtaka, stood the 3 shining lampposts of the Lord Nyaja, and the temple's moat contained water from the Angara. As a reward for passing her catechism, Pilamar invited Margret's friend Sainlain, daughter of the Duke of Darzaz, to accompany her father to Tserthatan. The Duke had left his son at home with the Duchess, that she might show him the accounts and prepare him for the day when he must rule Darzaz himself. Darzaz was warmer than Ihalimu, but oft buffeted by heavy winds, caused, it was said, by the wind-bird flapping its wings. Although Darzaz was in the empire, its remoteness from court meant that its nobles could afford to pay less heed to the emperor, though they durst not ignore him altogether. The Duke spent most of his time with Margret's father, doubtless discussing boring grown-up matters. He wasn't exactly rude to Margret and Adri, but wasn't very friendly to them either. But then, he was a little cold and distant even towards his own daughter. So it was that the girls were oft left to their own devices. One morning, after a brief visit to the kennels, they fed the striped pheasants that wandered freely around the gardens. Then they went to the stables to pet the horses. Margret complained loudly about not having been given her own horse. She always had to borrow one from the grown-ups. Horses on the continents of North and South Isharad have 3 toes, not just one like Eurasian horses, and tend to be slightly smaller. "Why do I have to wait till I'm 9 for a horse of my own?" she whinged. "I ask several times a year and always get the same answer." Sainwain, who had had her own horse for a year now, made a helpless gesture. "It's so unfair," said Margret for about the 18th time. "I wish I was 9 already." "At least we have our funurus," said Adri. This was true. Margret's funuru, or in Kallumans, Ushin, was a small, soft creature with white fur and large liquid eyes who emitted cooing sounds when petted. Her name was Moraishu. Not very imaginatively, Adri called hers Moraishuru, and the twain often grazed together in the gardens. Although Margret loved her funuru dearly, the creature didn't have quite the cachet of a horse. But Margret soon forgot all about pets. "Oh, we don't need a horse," said Sainwind. "Let's go visit the peasants. We can do an inspection. We're nobility, so they have to let us talk to them." Margret agreed with alacrity. Her parents had already begun taking her along on their inspections of the estates, which had promptly become one of her favorite activities. She bombarded the peasants with questions about the harvests and about their lives and customs, or learnt from them about plants and their properties, which ones were poisonous, which ones they used for clothes, and so forth. The peasants knew about medicinal herbs like oroflex and pepper and, well, nearly all the plants in the gardens had some medicinal use or other. Margret would watch as the peasants harvested rice, millet, and the blue-green spinach-like plant called thua, or tended the orchards of plum and northern mango and fruit beech. notophagus, or she would inquire after the health of the herds of Balach, a milk-producing ungulate related to antelopes, singular ball, or their wool camels or pouch goats. In short, she showed more enthusiasm for the inspections than her parents perhaps had in mind. "All right," she said, "we'll go to the main village and tell fortunes from fruit with the peasant girls." She knew that Audrey was a little afraid of the peasants, but loved the fortune-telling, not least because it could be combined with munching. Not least because it could be combined with munching. A wormy fruit was bad luck in more senses than one. Her calculation proved correct, and Audrey happily agreed to the plan. So the girls followed Margret to the village, where they spent an agreeable hour or two in fructomancy. After luncheon, the girls went back to the village and listened to an old peasant woman tell tales about Erache, the tree's son, the stick, and how the rain spirit saved him from the fire demons. "The peasants still believe that trees have souls, and I half believe it myself," Margret explained. "Me too," said Audrey. "The peasants in Darzas fear evil spirits that bring the blight," said Senwain. "They call them Lechi." "We call them Ache," said the peasant woman. "They dwell underground. In ancient times, before the truth came to Ichalamu, people were buried alive so the demons could eat them instead of bringing the blight. Now Kara protects us from them. He and the Palcham." She pointed to effigies made some of fern leaves, some of horsetails, some of branches, all standing by the lintels of the peasants' huts. They represented the guardians that had been worshipped before the Kallumans had learnt the truth, and were still venerated. "I love them," said Margret. At this point, the peasant woman had to go back to her chores, so the girls wandered through the village, a haphazard collection of round huts, until they came upon some peasants dressed in white tossing grain into the water. "What are you doing?" asked Margret. "We are feeding the river, my lady," they said. "We do it at weddings or harvests so the river will bless us. It is fitting to give to the river if we want the river to give to us." "That's a nice custom. I'll ask my parents if we can do that too." "Rivers and Darzas eat meat," remarked Sainline. "If you give them anything else, they'll flood your lands." Everyone laughed. Have a second. Alas, the next encounter was not so pleasant. Some peasants did not appreciate the lord's daughter shoving her nose into their affairs on top of all their other duties. A peasant's life was hard, and some resented the tribute imposed by Pilamar and his retinue, even if he was milder than most lords. And probably the girls ought not to have cut across the peasants' fields to ask one of them what he was doing. Margret received a sharper response than she expected. "I am harvesting food for your father," said the peasant caustically. "Not content with his own food, he must have ours as well. Ours and our children's." That was like a slap in the face. "My father is a kind man. He feeds and protects you. Margret retorted. Audrey began edging back. Audrey began edging back. The peasant was a big, burly man with a harsh voice, and she was shy even of the, quote, nice, end quote, peasants. Sandaranian looked unimpressed, and remarked afterwards that the peasants in Darzos were far bigger and angrier. The peasant laughed sarcastically. We feed him. I'm sure he's very kind to you, my lady. You're not a peasant, are you? Peasant still said my lord or my lady rather than great one, let alone little great one. Must you go, he added. We labor enough for your father without having to entertain his daughters as well. Let's go, said Sandaranian. This is no fun at all. Margret was minded to agree. She inclined her head with what dignity she could muster, and led her companions back to the castle. Not understanding the reasons behind the peasant's attitude, she resolved to avoid the resentful and, to her mind, mean, quote, mean, end quote, peasants and visit the nice, quote, nice ones instead. There were, after all, plenty of peasants who loved her father and found her interests charming. I don't want to talk to peasants anymore, said Audrey. She looked ready to cry. My father would have them punished, remarked Sandaranian. Page down, I tell you to. They're not all like that, said Margret. The ones who were sacrificing to the river were nice. They were also among the better off peasants, coincidentally. I hope father and mother let us join them. Unfortunately, when she asked at supper that evening, her parents said no. Feed it what? Asked the count sharply. Oh, just bits of grain, she replied. The peasants do it so the river will bless them. It is time you stopped pretending to be a peasant, said her father. You will be lady here one day. Can I at least make an effigy? They guard the peasants' houses. That's perfectly appropriate for peasants, but is not a suitable occupation for a lady, replied the countess. Would you have it said that you made peasant dolls? Margret felt that having two fun things forbidden in a row was carrying it too far. Why not? What's bad about it? There's nothing bad at all. For a peasant, explained Markaruna, but you are not a peasant, and never can be. Ishtaka willed otherwise. Your time would be better spent weaving tapestries of holy persons than making effigies of them, added Pilamar. As we have told you, I know not how many times, you will rule here. You must learn to behave according to your rank. Did you not understand what I told you about pretending to be a peasant? You are getting old for these games. Margret bowed her head, but she was not ready to give up visiting the peasants yet, whatever her parents might say. The next day, the Count and Countess took the girls to visit the town of Anathos, in hopes that a dose of civilization would counteract the allure of peasant life. The town was a short journey from Tserthaton by boat, but Margret seldom went there, and neither Audrey nor Sandaranian had ever been. half a second. I had to do a little edit there. Had ever been. So the town was a short journey from Tserthaton by boat, but Margret seldom went there, and neither Adri nor Sinan had ever been. Anethos was a modest town, with the round wooden houses typical of Ichalamu, the only large building being the pyramidal town hall and the Ingra or temple, an enneagonal stone building that was almost as tall as Tserthaton. The shops were for the most part mere stalls, or at best the usual round houses with a little statue on the lintel symbolizing the wares on offer. To Margret and Adri, though, Anethos seemed enormous, and its Margret a cornucopia of marvelous things. Adri loved the toy shops, and even Margret was sufficiently entranced by a copy of the Legend of the Palms that she almost forgot her infatuation with the peasantry. The book box had a beautiful illustration of the sacred palm trees of Tharmalon, prophesying the future of Ichalamu, and Margret couldn't keep her eyes off it. Books in the Uchandraist world were folded in squares or triangles and placed in a box, whereon the author, title, and often the subject were written. As for Sainlain, she had once or twice been to Zudzeach, the nearest town to her father's castle, but that was scarce more than a large village, with no shops to speak of and only a smallish temple. She was bowled over and wanted to buy one of everything, and she resented having to limit herself to one golden emperor's worth of clothes. To add to the girl's pleasure, all the people seemed to love the Count and Countess, possibly because they tossed gold and silver coins to the commons from a balcony in the town hall. Later, however, she would learn that the wealthy found her parents' upkeep rather a burden. The girls were also given coins to toss to the people, but were not given much opportunity to speak to them, to Margret's disappointment. Then they saw the beggar. He was at least 50, was missing several teeth, and had one foot smaller than the other. His only clothing was a ragged tunic made for a man twice his size. "Alms," he cried out, "alms for a poor cripple, the victim of a cruel landlord." Sainlain recoiled from the man's stench, and Adri, frightened, hid behind her mother. But Margret stopped and stared, ignoring her parents' efforts to prod her on. "What did your landlord do to you?" she asked. "He kicked me out of my room when I could no longer pay rent," he replied. "My infirmities mean that I can't work, and so I have no money to pay." "Father, you must pay his rent for him," pleaded Margret. The Count grumbled a little, but agreed. However, when Margret added, I'll come and visit you and teach you to read," he intervened and said to the beggar, "It may be a while before she can keep that promise." Then he quickened his pace, and once they were well out of earshot, he turned to Margret and said, "You have a good heart, and you are not wrong to try to help him, but you ought not to have promised to visit him." "Why not?" said Margret, rather too loudly. Parliament made a gesture for quiet and explained, "One should never be cruel to the commons, and one should treat them with justice, mercy, and generosity. But we are too far above them for anything else. We can never be their friends." Margret still couldn't see why not, but held her tongue for once and went back to admiring the lovely book box that housed the legend of the poems. She was due to begin studying geography the next day and hoped her new acquisition would impress her governess. She did not forget the encounter with the beggar, but allowed herself to be distracted for now by her desire to learn. And that's going to have to do for now. I'll read the rest of it later, either later tonight or maybe on the weekend. So have a good day. Have a riot.